Hello, a very good evening. If you've just joined us, it's 9 on LBC. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. Now, over the past, 7 or 8 years, we've talked about fracking quite a lot on the programme. Less so, I suppose, in the past few years, but certainly back in the early part of the 2010s, it was certainly a big matter of conversation. And then it's become a big matter of conversation again because, of course, Liz Truss seems to be wedded to the idea of fracking. There's been a vote in the House of Commons this evening which has endorsed fracking. Conservative MPs were whipped to vote for it, a 3-line whip. There were all sorts of scenes, which we talked about earlier. We might talk about a little bit later in this hour as well. But I've thought for some time that we ought to get more deeply into fracking because I think there are lots of people listening to this programme who have a vague understanding of what it means, but maybe not a massive understanding. And I would count myself, I don't regard myself as an expert on fracking. I'm slightly on the fence on it, which I'm not normally on the fence on these things, but I think there are all sorts of different things that we need to bear in mind. Obviously, any environmental consequences of fracking. Can it really contribute to our sort of basket of fuels that we need to have over the next 10 to 20 years to meet our energy needs? So I thought I'd invite two people into the studio on both sides of the argument who know what they're talking about, I hope. I'm sure they do. And it's your opportunity to, give your views on fracking. Do you think it is something that the UK should be investigating more seriously? Or are you afraid of the consequences, even though you may not be able to put your finger on it? I'd love to hear from you. But also, if you've got questions on fracking, I'm sure my two colleagues will be able to answer them. Charles McAllister is Director of Policy for Government and Public Affairs for the industry group UK Onshore Oil and Gas. And Bob Ward is Director of Policy at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment at the London School of Economics. So the number to call, 0345 6060 973. Well, let's start off with how we've got to this point and sort of where fracking has come from, how prevalent is it throughout the world, and why are people so anxious about it? Charles, let's start with you.
Okay, well, in for UK context, let's go back to 2019. That's when the government applied a moratorium on associated high-volume hydraulic fracturing, as defined in the Infrastructure Act. Now, our view at the time was it should never have been introduced. So we've been pushing every day since it has been, and thankfully the government decided that it was appropriate for it to be lifted. Now, in terms of international use, it is a standard oil field practice. It's used in the offshore oil and gas industry all the time. You don't hear that very often. I mean, in America, 600,000 shale gas wells have been drilled. It's used in Canada, South America, all parts of Asia. So, I mean, an onshore oil and gas in the UK, for example, isn't new. You know, we've been doing this for 170 years. We've drilled roughly 2,500 wells onshore in the UK.
We don't hear about that very much, do we?
Indeed. I don't know. I'm trying my best here, Ian.
But why has it become such a matter of controversy?
Great question. I mean, in my view, the case for fracking in the UK is so overwhelming. So I don't know why it has become such a focus of controversy. I really don't.
But you're paid to say that.
Well, I mean, that's cheap political theatre, though. I mean, I did research on this before. I haven't just been helicoptered into this industry recently. You know, I did a master's on fracking at Durham. I've been working for the industry for 6-7 years.
So you genuinely believe in it?
I really, really do. I mean, I do think the economic, environmental and geopolitical consequences of not doing this are really, really severe.
Bob Ward, where do you think that fracking has come from and why has it become such a matter of controversy in this country?
Well, good evening, Ian. So perhaps we should just remind people what fracking is, because it gets used a lot, the term. It's actually short for the something called hydraulic fracturing, and it's used to extract oil and gas from so-called tight rocks. What that means is that the oil and gas is inside the rock and cannot naturally move out of it. It doesn't have a lot of interconnected pores like sandstones. And so in order to extract oil and gas, you have to fracture the rock. And the way you do that is that you send down a kind of a liquid with sand and other things in it under high pressure and fracture the rock around the drilling site. The act of fracturing the rock surprisingly doesn't really cause very much disturbance at the surface. But what can happen is that the high pressure fluids can get into other faults in the rock and cause them to slip, and that can cause small tremors, which can, if they're large enough, cause disturbances at the surface. And the moratorium was introduced in 2019 because there had been a series of small tremors recorded around an experimental exploratory well site in near Blackpool. And as a result of the investigation there, they ruled that they couldn't rule out tremors that could damage nearby buildings. We fast forward now, Kwasi Kwarteng, when he was Energy Secretary, commissioned a study by the British Geological Survey to say, is that still a risk? The report was published on the day that the government announced that it was abolishing the moratorium. And surprisingly, the report said there's no evidence that the risk is any lower than we originally assessed. But Jacob Rees-Mogg said that people should be prepared to accept the risk of potential damage to property.
Any of that you disagree with, Charles?
Okay, that's the damage to property bit we need to be really clear on. If I can just go through the whole Seismic Regulations and then what happened here. So the regulations that were put in place for us meant that we had to stop if we induced a seismic event of greater than 0.5 on the Richter scale. According to a study by Liverpool University, what is felt at the surface from that kind of event is the same as me sitting down on this chair, so I don't really think you'd feel that.
I did feel the earth move.
I'm offended. If we look at the moratorium itself, the seismic event from the Preston New Road 1Z well, on which the moratorium was based, not the larger event, people commonly confuse that. The 1.5, the surface vibration from that event, again, according to the study by Liverpool University, is the same as dropping a honeydew melon in your kitchen. So that's what the moratorium is based on. If we look at the largest event, the 2.9 on the Richter scale, the surface vibration from that event was 8.2 millimeters per second, lasted for 2 seconds, okay? And that is half the maximum permitted at construction sites in the UK. So what I'm saying is, if the moratorium had been applied evenly across the UK, you would also have shut down the construction industry, the geothermal industry, and the quarrying industry. Because a really important point in the BGS analysis is it said that there was an inconsistent regulatory framework. So what is going on with the geothermal project in Cornwall? They don't use a Richter scale system. They don't have the same limits we do. Why is it acceptable for them and not acceptable for us?
Bob?
So Charles didn't disagree with the finding of the report that they cannot rule out earth tremors that register a magnitude of 3 or above, which could damage property. Now, people then should be able to make a decision about whether they want to take that risk. I mean, I'm not saying ban it on the basis of that, but let's be clear that that's what the risk is. And it's caused by reactivation faults that the BGS report said you cannot predict in advance whether there's going to be any trouble. It's too difficult. And the experience in the United States, where there's been a lot of fracking, is that you can get those larger earthquakes and that they could cause damage to buildings nearby.
Can I explain this? Okay. The reason why there are those types of seismic events is we use something called 3D seismic to map the subsurface. Seismic events that are being triggered are caused by faults that are really small. We can't see them. We can see the bigger faults. The idea there would be these larger events, anything greater than a 3.1, is untrue. Read the frack plan that Quadrilla put together. They said the maximum that could be induced during their operations was 3.1.
Well, okay? I'm sure the company says that, but that's not what the BGS said, is it, Charles?
Read the report. No, that's exactly what it says.
No, it didn't.
You can see. Okay, let's look at previous coal mining in the UK. It tended to induce around a 3 because of faults they couldn't see. Read what academics from Durham University have said. Read the written ministerial statement that Ed Davey, not the biggest fracking fan, said in 2012. He recognised that as well. He said around up to a 3. And because we can't see that, the larger faults we can see, and therefore we target the drill around those. And again, If that is such a big issue, why isn't there discussion about the geothermal industry or the construction industry?
I want to come on to the experience of other countries, because obviously we're not the only country. The United States has done probably more fracking than any other country in the world, but let's talk about that in a moment. And we'll come to your calls as well. Lots coming through already. 0345 6060 973. You can take your views on fracking, pro or anti, or if you've got a question for my two experts here. It's 16 minutes past 9.
This is LB's Tweet at LBC.
20 past 9. We're talking about fracking. We have Charles McAllister with us, Director of Policy for Government and Public Affairs for the industry group UK Onshore Oil and Gas. And Bob Ward is Director of Policy at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Before we come to calls and texts, and there are a lot of texts particularly, let's talk about the situation in America and maybe other countries. Bob, let's start with you. What has been the general experience of fracking abroad?
Well, the most successful use of fracking has been in the United States, and it's part of the reason why the US is now one of the world's leading producers of oil and gas. It has been cheap, and actually it has been responsible for helping the US reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, because they have been able to use more gas for electricity generation. And when you burn gas to generate electricity, you produce half as much carbon dioxide as you would if you were burning coal. And so it's been helpful. But when people talk about a comparison of the UK and the US experience, what they forget is that the population of the United States is 5 times greater than Britain, but the area of the United States is 40 times greater. And the wide open spaces of places like Oklahoma, where they've done a lot of fracking, are not the same as New Preston Road on Blackpool.
I've actually got a question on that from Lance, who says, people often say fracking in the USA is different to here, as it's a huge country and they frack where there's no population. But I read that in the United States, 15 million people live within 1 mile of a fracking well. Is that true?
Yep.
Yeah, well, Charles knows the statistic.
Inside out, upside down.
Yeah.
That's true. That is true. If I can just go for the land use point, you could use that argument against many technologies. So one of the biggest advantages of fracking, why it's an excellent technology, is the energy density is very, very high. So a shale gas pad is about 2 hectares in size, roughly the size of Parliament Square. To produce the same amount of energy from a wind farm, you need a land area 725 times the size, or a solar farm 450 times the size. So you can't use land use as an excuse against fracking if you're not going to do it for renewables.
But we are a smaller country in terms of land mass. But we presumably have more people that would be living quite close to a fracking site. And I wonder how many people would be comfortable with that.
Again, it's not industrialisation of the countryside. Look at the modelling that we've done. Again, we haven't been able to fully flow test a well, but based on the cores, the rock that we've taken out, we can make estimates as to how many sites we would need. To make the UK self-sufficient by the 2030s, we would need between 100 and 400 sites across the UK. It's 0.002% of the UK's landmass. That's not industrialisation of the countryside.
Well, are you seriously suggesting that we could be self-sufficient in energy through fracking by the
natural
2030s?
gas?
In natural gas?
Yes. Look at the modelling that we've done on that. It's totally credible based on the core we've taken out. Because again, if you look at the core from the East Midlands site, the IGAS, NEOS, Egdon Resources joint venture, the core, the rock taken out from that well suggests an in-place yield, so the amount of gas per square mile, double that of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania.
Right, well, let's go to your calls. If you want to ask our experts a question, 0345 6060 973. Rob is in Medway. Hello, Rob.
Hello, how are we doing? Easy-ish question. What is the relationship between geothermal energy and fracking?
Okay. Shall I go for that? Yeah, sure. So, I mean, they're very, very similar. So in a shale gas well, what you will do is you will drill down, typically around 2.5 kilometres, and then you'll drill horizontally 2.5 kilometres. Then you'll pump water down and you'll fracture the rock as you go along. And that's into the shale. At a geothermal site, what you will tend to do for a hot rocks project, because there's different types of geothermal, you'll drill one borehole down to about 3-4 kilometres and then one much, much deeper into the granite. That's about maybe 6-7 kilometres. And then you'll pump water down, and what that does is it fractures, or it goes through the fractures in the granite in between those two. That can induce seismicity, has done in Cornwall in the last few years. Again, they're under a totally different regulatory framework than us. And then what happens is the water goes up to the shallower well, comes out as steam, and then it drives a generator. And it's a great technology. I think it's a fantastic idea. We're not anti-geothermal. What we're asking for is we want the regulations that they have. We want parity.
Bob?
Yeah, so this really comes down to whether you believe that people have a right to object to having fracking in near them, right? And that's the test that the government used for many years to avoid the greater deployment of onshore wind. It made it so difficult locally and allowed local objections. So at the very least, the government needs to create a level playing field. But there is a very big difference in the popularity of the two technologies at the moment. If you look at the most recent polling done by the government, it shows massive support for renewables. The latest poll in the summer showed 85% support or strong support for renewables and 17% support for fracking.
But the government have said that this will be done by local consent, whatever that means, that local people will have a say in whether fracking is allowed in their area.
So I don't object in principle to fracking if it can be done safely and that the local community buy in. And that might mean bribing them in some way, giving them cheap energy. That's fine. My main objection to fracking at the moment is that it will not make any difference to the current cost of energy crisis. Because
but it might
it's
in 10
simply
years.
not.
The current, nothing will then.
It's a distraction people have been making the claim that it would help us with the current crisis. If you go on the website of lots of people have said, we have heard lots of politicians make the claim, including lobbyists from Tufton Street, arguing that it would reduce the price of electricity or gas.
But it could in the long term,
yes, it can.
it?
Well, yeah, okay, so fine. If you want to make a case that we should be talking about the long term instead of the current crisis, then fine.
Yeah.
But the problem has been some people have claimed that lifting the moratorium would somehow help us deal with the current crisis.
I mean, you can't name anybody. Who's claimed that?
I can tell you, Matt Ridley has made that claim several times.
Okay.
And who? I mean, Matt Ridley is who? I mean, he's not part of the government. He's not.
No. He used to be a Conservative MP, a Conservative member of the House of Lords. He's a prominent lobbyist for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and there have been plenty of people who have made the claim that it could reduce.
But no one from the government.
No.
Nobody from the current government, no.
Yeah. Let's get this right here. There is, in terms of delivering the maximum amount of energy in the least amount of time with the least amount of land, fracking is the best technology in the UK.
In the long term. Do you agree that it can't do anything in the short term?
Define short term. I've again heard this.
In the next 2 years?
In the next 2022, 2023, we will not be able to get enough shale gas on the market to have a material impact on price. Absolutely. But there's 3 ways that shale gas can reduce prices in what I would call the short to medium to long term, okay? So number 1 is community benefits. It's not a bribe. We haven't just plucked this out of our behind recently. We've had a communities benefits package in place for years, okay? What that does is for an exploration site, and this could give immediate relief to people. For an exploration site, £100,000 goes to the local community. That can be used for whatever they want. At the site in Lancashire, when local people were polled, 80% said, we'll take a check. If we go to a production site...
So it is a bribe?
It's not a bribe at all, because the other industries do it as well. It's not just us. Again, we haven't just... We've taken the models from other, but we've tweaked it slightly for shale, because there's a difference between exploration and production. For a production site, some of the companies have committed to 6% of revenue for a 40 well site at gas prices seen only last week. That could be £400 million over 20 years. That is material. That's 1. 2 is what we can do is if we over-rely on LNG, what we have to do is we have to compete with 42, 43 other countries around the world in order to attract these boats to meet our gas demand. The more self-sufficient we are, the less we have to do that, the more price will come down. And then option 3 industry has already said they are willing to engage to sell natural gas, especially to blue hydrogen production facilities of the future, at contracted prices, and that gives them stability, which is key for decarbonisation at least.
Just before we go to the news, question for you, Charles, from Chris, who says, please ask Mr McAllister who funds the organisation he's representing tonight. Transparency is key in making a decision on the discussion tonight.
More to political theatre. So I'm funded by the companies, that the 5 shale gas companies.
So you're a trade association?
Yeah, we're a trade body. We represent the 5 shale gas companies, a number of conventional onshore oil and gas companies, and the supply chain. We were totally honest about that. But again, find something and I said it's factually inaccurate, you won't.
Bob?
Who funds me?
Well, I know who funds it. I wasn't asking you that question, but I mean, do you have any sort of... I want to respond
to something that Charles said about self-sufficiency. Now, it's true, we don't know how much gas, how much shale gas there is, and we don't know how much we might be able to extract commercially. So people who claim that we could be self-sufficient are technically correct, but it's far from certain. And I would observe that when you go on the...
Yeah, absolutely. We need to flow test wells in order to prove, because there's a difference, I do just quickly, there's a difference between resource and reserve. Resource is what's under the ground. Fact, 500 years. The question is, what is the estimated recoverable reserve? So
let me just quote some figures from Charles's organisation website. Their most optimistic scenario that they published showed that in three years after the start of commercial fracking, you might extract 57 billion cubic feet per year of gas.
Right.
Last year, the EU 27 plus the UK were importing 9 billion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas per day. So if you make that calculation, UK shale gas would basically cover less than 2% of the imports of liquefied natural gas. That's why it's not going to make any difference.
Then what happens in year 5 to 9 and then 9 to 13?
Well, you tell me.
I will tell you. It shows that we can be self-sufficient. We can be self-sufficient in natural gas by the 2030s. If we get more North Sea production, that can be faster. And honestly, we want demand reduction as well. We want all these things. If you rely on imports, you can't get the taxes. You can't fund the decarbonisation projects that can reduce demand. That is in our interest as well. This isn't a fracking or nothing. It's a fracking and everything.
OK, well, we're going to find out in a moment a little more about what happened in Parliament tonight on this fracking vote, and then we'll return to your calls and texts in minutes. Tom in Ottershaw says, Iain, this debate on fracking is brilliant. I'm willing to bet that your listeners are already better informed than 90% of MPs. That's not a high bar, Tom, if I may say so. Charles McAllister is here, Director of Policy for Government and Public Affairs for the industry group UK Onshore Oil and Gas, and Bob Ward is Director of Policy at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Right, let's go to another question from Alicia in Falmouth. Hello, Alicia.
Hiya. So I know nothing about fracking, obviously, but it takes about 30 seconds to find anecdotal evidence and videos online of communities who live near fracking wells where they can literally set fire to their tap water because the gases have leaked into their water supply, and there's no recompense from the government, and communities that say that they have been devastated by fracking. I suppose it's less of a question, more of an interested concern, really, and I'd like to understand what your views are on this.
Charles, this thing about taps on fire, I have seen pictures of this. It does happen, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't. It looks frightening, but there's no evidence that fracking causes that. I mean, look at in parts of the United States, methane is naturally occurring in the water. Perfect example of this is in New York State. Never fracked a well ever. You can set your water on fire. It's because it's naturally occurring. If I can just... the problem was the fracking industry in America couldn't prove that because they didn't do the baseline monitoring that we are required to do. So I can just describe to you how the regulations are in place to protect groundwater. So there's several layers. Number one, the Infrastructure Act bans fracking shallower than 1 kilometre in the UK. The shale's 2 kilometres deep, and the maximum fractures you would get, fractures don't really extend more than 300 metres. That's what you would get. So the gap is huge. That's one. Two is the well integrity regulations are regulated by the Health and Safety Executive are unbelievably tight. And again, this is their bread and butter. They do it offshore. They've been doing it onshore for decades. So let's look at other regulations as well. The chemicals that we have to use have to be designated non-hazardous to groundwater by the Environment Agency, or we can't use them. And we're also required to do comprehensive groundwater monitoring before, during and after fracking. and that's public. You can see.
But why is it that, for example, Quadrilla, who had the initial fracking sites, they've decided to pull out of it completely?
No, they haven't.
Haven't they?
No. They're one of my members. They're absolutely there.
What did I read the other day, that they'd made some negative statement?
No, the guy who started Quadrilla hasn't worked for the company for 10 years, okay? He made some pretty disparaging comments. I think it is, he is not best placed to comment. He said that geology wouldn't work now, but would have worked 10 years ago. He said there aren't enough rigs, but we should go for geothermal. It's quite hard to drill a geothermal well without a rig. Okay. So it's not a piece that I take in any way seriously.
Bob? Do you disagree with any of what Charles said about the tap issue?
No. I think it's important here that when you're assessing what you see on social media, you should be always sceptical, no matter what you're feeling, and beware of things that you think support your position. So it's quite true. There are lots of pictures circulating from the US of people setting tap water on fire. It's natural gas that has naturally occurred. It's nothing to do with fracking. It's a deliberate attempt to mislead people. Most of the contamination of groundwater that occurs as a result of fracking is not the fracking process itself. It is weak regulation around the disposal of wastewater, and it's that wastewater actually that can generate a lot of the seismic activity as well. So I say, if you're going to assess whether you are for or against fracking, make sure you're well informed and be sceptical about all sources.
Alicia, are you a little bit reassured by those two answers?
Yeah, no, that's literally why I phoned up to ask, because I don't know anything about it.
Thank you. Oh, it's great to have some consensus question as well. Thank you very much indeed, Alicia. Right, we have to take a break now. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a second. I think we're going to do this again because so many people want to get on air. It's 9:46.
Text 84850.
10 to 10 on LBC. I should bring you the news that Wendy Morton, the government chief whip, and her deputy have apparently unresigned. So they're back. The chaos continues, but not in this studio. We're talking about fracking. And I actually think we're learning quite a lot about it. I hope you are, anyway. Somebody here on Twitter says that Charles McAllister is a lobbyist, which I think you'd plead guilty to that, wouldn't you? But there's
I'd run the trade body, but again, find something I said that isn't factually accurate, as I said, you won't.
Right, let's move on to a text question from Gillian Enfield. There is evidence of water contamination caused by fracking. Would your experts be honest about this, Bob?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier that there has been evidence of contamination of groundwater in the US, and that's been associated primarily with the use of the wastewater. You use a lot of water in the process of fracking, so it's not the fracking itself that causes the contamination. It's basically, if you have a lot of water that you're using and you don't store it properly, it contaminates it. So if you regulate properly, you can avoid that happening.
Yeah, and obviously, if I can just say, like in the US, what they're allowed to do is they take the wastewater that comes from the shale gas sites and then they stick it down wells. Bob correctly says that can also induce seismicity. That's banned in the UK. We have to send it to licensed facilities that are already taking wastewater that's coming from the offshore.
There's a lot of wastewater, though, isn't there?
It's not huge amounts. So, like, people, again, always say, the industry's going to use huge amounts of water. At full pelt, in terms of water consumption, we would use less than 1% of what industry, agriculture and households use in any 1 year.
Peter is in Stockport. Hi, Peter.
Hello. So my question, hi guys. My question is I'm very sympathetic, shall we say, because I think where science is involved and emotion is involved, it's very difficult to frame the questions in a way that reaches out to the science. So I'm on the science side rather than the emotional side on this, but I understand it's difficult. The reason that I phoned is I worked I still work in an office, but obviously pandemics rule applies. Opposite my office, there was building work, and the thudders from the building work was so severe. It was. Do you remember the scene in Jurassic Park where they've got the cup of water on the dashboard, and you see the shaking water? It was worse than that in the office. So the argument with regards to other industries have got less restrictions on the amount of shakes from the work. What kind of time period would you expect there to be for the fracking? Would it be a week? Because the office work was for a week, so for a week we're all like, what's going on in the office? Or would it be intermittent for the duration of the well being active, or whatever it would be?
Great question, totally fair question. So at the Preston New Road site, when they were fracking the 2 wells, there was only one felt seismic event, and that lasted for 2 seconds. So it's not over the life of the well, it's not while they're drilling, it's not constantly while they're fracking. 2 seconds. So there's exactly the point you make. The regulations that are set for the construction industry set a limit. We induced half of that over 2 seconds. They're allowed to limit up to double that, and they're allowed to do it at a much more constant intensity.
Bob, do you agree with that?
Well, the problem here is that Charles perhaps can talk about how long you would be pumping from a well that was actually producing, and all during the period of fracking is when you get the greatest risk of there being movements that could cause damage. Now, it's not going to be a huge earthquake that would devastate the country, but it could damage nearby property. And it's about people having the choice about whether they want to have that risk. And it should apply to other industries. That's absolutely right. But when people say, oh, well, it doesn't matter, or you have to bear the cost yourself for the greater good, I think we need to have a proper discussion about how you help people and whether people can get insurance, for instance, to cover damage to their home that might be caused by fracking.
Right, Peter, thank you for that. Let's move on to Dan in Plymouth. Hello, Dan.
Hi there. Quick question. What parts of the UK geographically is the fracking industry looking at mainly?
Bob?
Which parts of the UK? Well, most of the attention has been on the Bowland Shale, which is in the northwest of England, in Lancashire. That's where the biggest expected so-called resources are. That's basically the total amount of gas in the rock. We don't have any idea about how much of that could be extracted. And one thing to be aware of is that when a company drills, and this applies as well to offshore drilling, they're trying to work out what will be the gas price at the time that they start to extract it. You know, it's unlikely to be, and let's hope it's not as high as it is today. One of the reasons that drilling and production in the North Sea was on the decline before the pandemic was simply the price of oil and gas was too low to make it commercially viable. So the question of how much is commercially viable is a question we don't know, and one you would only discover by doing the actual drilling itself and testing.
Charles?
Okay, so, I mean, the Bowland Shale, the Bowland Harbour Shale formation goes over all across the north of England. So imagine like a Jaffa cake and sort of bite the top off and then lay that over the north of England. You've got sort of northwest doglegging into the East Midlands and then up into North Yorkshire. That's the key Bowland Shale area. Just again, I always hear, oh, there's going to be fracking in the south of England or in the Weald or something. There are no proposals from any of the companies that I'm working for associated high volume hydraulic fracturing in the south of England. It's all conventional. The oil and gas just flows without needing to frack. It's permeable, or it's a high porosity, as Bob said earlier on.
Dan, thank you. Gary is a new caller in Llanelli. Hello, Gary.
Hello, how are you, Iain?
Hi, very well.
Let's say that for the sake of argument, that fracking's been allowed. The shale gas has been extracted from the ground. To what I understand, it is then sold on the international energy market. It will not be kept for use exclusive in the UK. It will be used basically for making profit for the energy companies. How does this alleviate the energy crisis in the UK in any way?
Okay, right, we've got 30 seconds each.
Yeah, okay, so name me a country on earth where they have consistent demand, they've increased production and then simultaneously increased exports. That doesn't happen. Gas is expensive to transport, prioritises local demand. That's it.
Yeah, so you're quite right. It would be sold on the market, and it would be you pay for it at the market rate, which at the moment is high.
And very finally, Rob says, can you ask your experts if they would be happy for fracking to happen near where they live or their family live? Charles?
Absolutely, especially if I get a share. If I get a community revenues.
I wouldn't want it in my back garden, but I'd be willing to have a discussion about whether it's in my neighbour's back garden.
Well, I love it. Right, we are going to repeat this exercise possibly in a couple of months' time because it's been very successful. I think we've all learned a lot from it. Thank you very much indeed to Charles McAllister and Bob Ward.